Okay everyone, so in this next lesson, let's talk about the input tag and the label tag so that we can complete our web form here, the sign up form. So the input tag here, as you can see here, this is a convenient way for us to get input from users. So it will be specifying an input field where the user can enter data, and it is the most important form element, and the input element can be displayed in several ways depending on the type attribute. We can see here the different examples of the value or the assigned value that we can implement while using the type attribute of the input tag. So some of this we will be applying in our project. One key thing that you will notice here is that the input tag is a self-closing element. So you would see here that one of the tips that were given here is that we always use the label tag to define labels for the input type text, input type checkbox, input type radio, input type file, and input type password. So if we go to the label tag here, the label tag defines a label for several elements, and these are some of those elements. And if we go down here, it says that the proper use of labels with elements above will benefit screen reader users. It will read out loud the label when the users focus on the element. Users who have difficulty clicking on very small regions such as checkboxes, because when a user clicks the text within the label element, it toggles the input and this increases the hit area. So just take note of those things and some of the other tips here. The for attribute label must be equal to the ID attribute of the related element to bind them together. A label can also be found to an element by placing the element inside the label element. Now if we go down here, we can see the for attribute specifies the ID of the form element that the label should be bound to. The form ID specifies which form the label belongs to. And we can also see here the default value for the CSS settings. Now what I want to do here is to go back to our code editor and let's try to work on our form here using those elements. So if you remember, one of the tips that I gave you was to gather some inspiration from popular websites that uses the same features that you would be implementing in your project. So let me just show you here a sign up form from Facebook, and you would see here that it has a very simple sign up form here, and it has an input tag used for the first name, last name, the email, and the new password here. So let's try to go and implement that here, okay? Let's first go and use an H1 heading here that will have a sign up text and a paragraph that contains it's quick and easy. Now let's go and add an HR horizontal rule line here with the style color of white. Let's have a line break here. Then use the input type text and the attribute placeholder here with the value of first name. And let's also give a name attribute here, which is first name, and we will tell the users that this is required. So if we try to refresh this, let's see how that will look on our browser here. Now you would see that we have our, once we try to inspect element this is our input type text here. And if I go and replace this, let's say I say this is last name. Last name. You would see that the placeholder text inside of the text input tag here was changed. Okay, so that's the use of the placeholder attribute. So let's go and try to close that and go back to our code editor here. So the name attribute that we have here is specifying the name of the input tag that we have here. Okay, so just take note of that. And the required attribute here is telling the user or telling the browser that before the user can submit the information, they have to fill out the information inside of the input tag here. So if we go back to our documentation here, you would see that if we go down here, you would see that the name attribute specifies the name of an input element, and if we click on that, it shows us the definition and usage. The name attribute specifies the name of an input element, and you would see that it is used to reference elements in a JavaScript or to reference form data after a form is submitted. We will not be covering JavaScript in this course, but at least you know that the name attribute here can be used to reference elements in JavaScript. So if we go back here again and we have the required attribute here that says that it specifies that an input element must be filled out before submitting the form. So I hope that's clear. Now let's go and copy this and replace the placeholder with last name. And of course, we also want to change the name here to last name. And let's also have another input tag here that will have a placeholder for enter email and a name value of email, and we also want this to be required. Now let's try to go back to our browser and check how that will look. Okay, so we now have 3 input tags inside of our signup HTML. Now let's try to go back to our code editor and copy this and create an input type with the value of password. And the placeholder here will be enter password. And of course, let's also change this to password as the name here. And we also need it to be required. Then let's have another one that will be used for, let me just go and put another placeholder here that will say that we want the user to repeat the password. And of course, we don't want the name to be PSW here. Instead, what we want to do here is to have it PSW short. You can use any name here, guys. So I'm just using PSW for the shortcut for the term password. Now let me just add some comments here, so at least it will be easy for us to identify the section of our form here. So this will be for section for password, and here this will be section for user information. Let's first try to check our browser and try to refresh on how this looks already. Okay, so we now have 5 input type or input elements inside of our sign up page. Now let's try to go and place here a label element for the password repeat. For the password first, so let's have password, or let's just have it small letters, and for the other one will be password repeat, and let's have this repeat password. So you will see we have the 4 attribute here that references the name of our input tag here that is required, similar with the label that we have here that references the input type here that we used as a name value for the name attribute that will be connecting the input type here to this label, to the password label here. So the for attribute, if we go back to our documentation here, let me just go back here and let's see. For attribute will be having the element ID and specifies the ID of the form element. The label should be bound to. So this is connected to the element. In our case, the input element that is with the type value password for the label password, and for the label repeat password, it is related to the input element with the value or with the name attribute value of password repeat. Let's also go and add an ID here for this input element, and let's call it also and give it the value, same value that we gave the name attribute here. Same goes with the other input type password here. We also give it the same ID for our label here. So at least it will be referencing, for this label it will be referencing this input element, for this label it will be referencing this input element. So if you go to our project documentation in W3 schools, you would see that if we go up here and check on the input type password, you would see that this is the basic format that we should be aware of. And you would see here that the input type password will define a password field, and the characters are masked. And there are some notes here. Any forms involving sensitive information like password should be served over HTTPS. So just take note of that, especially if your user or you're expecting your users to be entering any sensitive information such as passwords. They should always be served using HTTPS. And for additional information about this, you can go and look for the content here and try to read more about it. And it says here, Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure means HTTPS is an extension of the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, or HTTP. You will notice this in some of the websites that you visit. For cybersecurity purposes, this is something that you should also be aware of, because we would want to protect our users and clients, especially if they're handling sensitive information. We want to protect them from attacks or cyber attacks from coming from black hat hackers. Okay, so just take note of that. Another tip here is to always add the label tag for best accessibility practices. Let's just go and check here. Okay, so you can see here that we now have our password label and the repeat password label that is referencing the enter password for the password label, repeat password for the repeat password label. So that will be all for this lesson, and thank you. See you on our next lessons.